So the last talk for today is David Zapero from the University of Bonn, and the title is Can Thoughts Point? David?
Thank you, François. So, for quite some years now, it has been held, widely held, that indexicality is not just a feature of certain expressions in language, but also a feature of certain elements that can figure in thought. And my remarks are remarks of reticence about that idea, which has been quite widespread. I have two sets of remarks that I want to make. The first set of remarks concerns the idea that a truth bearer should have elements that are indexical. So I want to say something to the extent that, well, it had better not be the case that truth bearers have indexical elements. And my second set of remarks concerns the idea, and this is what is mostly meant by indexical thought and what concerns most people who appeal to that notion. My second set of remarks concerns the idea that the content of propositional attitudes should have indexical elements or should have to be specified with the help of indexical expressions. So to begin with the first point about truth bearers, I want to look a bit closer at the view that has served as a foil for many authors who have wanted to defend the idea of an indexical thought. In particular, I want to take as a point of departure a passage which is also mentioned in the abstract, which has been evoked at various points, and that is significant for reasons that may not have yet been mentioned, namely because it is part of Frege's intent to draw a certain distinction between thought and thought expression. So I begin by looking at the passage, which I take it you can read, yes. It often happens that the mere wording, which can be made permanent by writing or the gramophone, does not suffice for the expression of a thought. If a time indication is conveyed by the present tense, one must know when the sentence was uttered in order to grasp the thought correctly. Therefore, the time of utterance is part of the expression of the thought. If someone wants to say today that he expressed yesterday, what he expressed yesterday using the word today, he will replace this word with yesterday. Although the thought is the same, its verbal expression must be different in order that the change of sense, which would otherwise be affected by the differing times of utterance, may be cancelled out. The case is the same with words like here and there. In all such cases, the mere wording, as it can be preserved in writing, is not the complete expression. The knowledge of certain conditions accompanying the utterance, which are used as means of expressing the thought, is needed for us to grasp the thought correctly. So this passage is part of Frege's insistence on drawing a certain distinction, which he takes to be fundamental, a distinction between thought and the expression of thought. Now, on one side of that distinction, he places everything that contributes to, and I'll have something more to say about this notion, about everything that contributes to making recognizable thought, to conveying thought. So this notably includes language, but as was just pointed out in the previous talk, it also includes other forms of behavior, such as pointing, for instance. Now, since the means for giving expression to thought often rely on the circumstances in which that expressing takes place, the same piece or the same resource can be used on different occasions to express different things. And, well, conversely, the other way around, the same thought can be or may have to be expressed with different means on different occasions to take into account the way in which the circumstances in which the expressing takes place bears on the role or the achievement the task that those resources accomplish. So in the case of such words as today and yesterday, since those words accomplish the task of contributing to express a certain thought in a way that draws on the circumstances in which they're used, one has to, at times, use different words to compensate for the fact that one uses them on different occasions. So on the one side of this fundamental distinction is all that which contributes to expressing thought. On the other side of the distinction is thought itself, which of course is a notion that has been subject to much debate and has been the object of much reflection, but there's at least this much which one can gather from this passage, namely that thought is meant to be a determinate way for things to be true. We have a thought wherever we have a determinate way in which things might be true. So one might think of a thought as a determinate question of the form, is it true that so-and-so? But the important point is that it must have been settled just when things would be the relevant way. So Frege also has views as to just how many questions must have been settled for one to have a thought. But leaving that aside, the important point, the second important point, is that a thought for Frege is meant to be just that, just a determinate way for things to be true. He wants to distinguish the means by which one arrives at expressing the thought, that determinate way in which things might be true, from the thought itself. So he'll often insist that the thought itself is something fundamentally unlanguage-like, so to speak, something fundamentally different from, in nature, from language, which is on the other side of that fundamental distinction that he wants to draw. So he'll say things such as, oh, sorry, I forgot to scroll when I was making the distinction. Well, he'll say things such as, the thought, in itself imperceptible by the senses, gets clothed in the perceptible garb of a sentence and thereby becomes more amenable to being grasped. We say a sentence expresses a thought. So I don't want to get into questions about Frege interpretation. He also says things that one might take to be in conflict with what he's saying here. But at least in passages such as these, we have this fundamental distinction which is drawn between all that which contributes to expressing a thought and the thought itself, which is not in the line of business of expressing anything. So we have, so to speak, two registers that we distinguish in terms of two different lines of business. There's the line of business of expressing thought, and then there's the business of fixing a determinate question of truth. That requires that there be answers to just when things would be the relevant way. So on Frege's understanding of this distinction between thought and thought expression, members of each of the categories can only be a member of that category. The two are mutually exclusive. And this has to do simply with the fact that they perform fundamentally different tasks. So in one case, we have something which is perceptible. It's essential that indexicals or demonstratives, or for that matter, language generally as Frege conceives it, be perceptible in order to be able to accomplish the task of making recognizable thought. And then thought itself is not something perceptible. So on Frege's view of the matter, indexicals and demonstratives fall squarely on the side of thought expression. And they cannot, on his understanding of thought, be something that is on the side of thought. They don't perform the kind of task that members on that side of distinction perform. So, at least on this way of distinguishing between thought and thought expression, indexicals and demonstratives fall squarely on the side of thought expression and can't be something that figures in thought. I'll leave the little quotation by Evans aside for the moment, and maybe I'll come back to it. Now, one of the So one reaction to this distinction can be that while it makes sense to draw a distinction between thought and thought expression, or content and content bearers, there's nothing special about the Fregean conception of content. Why should we consider that what is always expressed is a Fregean thought? Might we not just work with another conception of content or another conception of thought? Of course, Fregean thoughts, as it's sometimes put, have absolute truth conditions. So that's the point that I put by saying that they raise a determinate question of truth. It just has to be settled when things would be the relevant way. But one might consider, well, might content, or what is given expression to, not be something else that doesn't have absolute truth conditions? If it doesn't, then again we might make space for the idea that on the level of what is expressed, there should be something like indexical or demonstrative elements, because the truth of what is expressed then depends, or may depend, on worldly factors, just the way in which the accomplishment of an indexical or a demonstrative depends on worldly factors. This is an idea that is implicit in much work that has been mentioned, particularly of unarticulated constituents. François gives expression to the idea quite explicitly in what he then calls the distribution principle at one point. So he writes, the determinants of truth value distribute over the two basic components truth evaluation involves, content and circumstances. So the idea is this is an idea I'll come back to, truth evaluability involves two parties. There's that which is true or false, and there's that which makes it true or false. That's one idea. It takes two to make truth. And then there's a separate idea that, well, what determines the truth value of whatever is true or false can perhaps be distributed over those two parties. Why should we assume that all the determinants are on one side of those two parties, right? So this is one way in which one might think, well, here there's room for introducing indexicality at the level of the truth bearer. And of course, formal semantics, various systems of formal semantics, offer us resources to think in that direction. By having certain parameters figure in the circumstances of evaluation instead of figuring in the content, for instance, if one takes Kaplan-style semantics. But I take it that this distribution principle is not just simply a remark about what is possible in certain systems of formal semantics. This is meant to be a remark about truth bearers, that we needn't think of truth bearers as being determinate in the way that Frege thinks that they have to be determinate. So let me say something about that idea, why I think it's in tension with a fundamental feature of the notion of truth, or the predicate is true. And then I'll move on to what is perhaps the more pressing issue of whether the content of psychological states can have indexical elements. So let me, sorry, I once again forgot to, okay. So let me cite some Aristotle. Aristotle says something which seems to be a bit of a platitude in the fourth book of his Metaphysics, when he writes, "To say of what is that it is not, or of what is not that it is to speak falsely, while to say of what is that it is, or of what is not that it is not, is to speak truly." Now, one reason why the remark can seem a bit odd is that Aristotle apparently here thinks of stating as always being, or stating when it's truth evaluable, as something that is always predicative. So he thinks that stating is always saying of what is or of what is not that it is or that it is not. But we can abstract that. So abstract from the idea that stating needs to be predicative, and then focus on the fact that there's of course, interesting symmetry here between speaking truly and speaking falsely. One might capture that by simply having the following remark. If things are as one represents them to be, one represents truly. If things are not as one represents them to be, one represents falsely. So on this way of capturing the remark, truth and falsehood for that matter, but we're focusing on truth, is the upshot of a meeting of two parties. There's the way things are represented to be, and then there's how things in fact are. We have truth when things are as they're represented to be. And secondly, more importantly, whether when one represents in the relevant sense of representing, whether one does so truly is determined merely by whether things are the relevant way. So the question of whether one has represented truly is the same as the question of whether things are as one has represented them. And saying that the question of whether one has represented truly is the same question as whether things are as one has represented them, is to say that in a certain sense, the notion being true lacks content. This is not to endorse deflationist conception of truth. Maybe that is the way that one should capture that contentlessness. We can discuss that if you like. I don't think so, in fact. But the point is that the platitude captures a way in which the content, in which the predicate is true is contentless. I think, in fact, that for Frege, this is quite fundamental as well. And when he insists on the point, he, of course, emphasizes the different ways in which the predicate is true can make a difference. Of course, is true when added to a sentence changes the sentence, and is true when used in a statement can use to a certain effect. But the important point is that when we are interested just in a determinate way for things to be true, is true should not add any content. And what this is meant to reflect is what one might call the objectivity of truth, the Aristotelian platitude, if that's what we want to call it, reflects the idea that truth is a particular kind of correctness, namely the kind of correctness that depends only on whether things are the relevant way. There are many kinds of correctness. Truth, one might think, is that kind of correctness which makes the correctness depend only on whether things are that way. And for it to do so, it's important that the question of how things being as they are bears on the truth of whatever is liable to being true have been settled. So for truth to be objective in that way, it's important that the two parties that come together in having truth, in fact, play particular roles. It's important that the party that's liable to being true have settled entirely the way in which things and being as they are matter for whether it is true or false. It can't, if one likes, the party which is true or false, leave open in which ways things and being as they are matter for its truth. So I take it that this is one way to think that Wittgenstein captures this nicely in the Tractatus when he speaks about a proposition restricting reality to two alternatives, yes or no. A proposition understood here as a truth bearer has to be such as to allow what determines its truth to simply give a yes or no answer. Are things the relevant way, or are they not the relevant way? So the point being that if one accepts what I've called the Aristotelian platitude, so the objectivity of truth, that places a certain constraint on the role that each of the two parties that matter for truth play. It means that one can't just distribute the determinants between the two parties in any way. It's important that the party which is liable to being true entirely fix those determinants so that the other party can just decide whether it is true or not. So if one wants to hold on to the objectivity of truth, one can't have that distribution of determinants of truth value I'm suggesting. So one might want to call into question the objectivity of truth. I mean, perhaps so-called faultless disagreement is a reason to call into question that feature of the notion of truth. But what I'm suggesting is if one doesn't, then one can't have something like a distribution principle, which allows one to have certain determinants of the truth value be on the side of what determines the truth of the content. This is related to matters about publicity of truth bearers, but I'll leave that aside for now. Now, you might feel that in having heard those remarks, that they're orthogonal to the concerns that most people have when they speak about indexical thought, because the concern is not primarily one about truth bearers, but is one about psychological states. The idea is that the content of psychological states should have indexical or indexical-like elements. And while I think that there are many reasons that can lead one to feel that such states or the content of such states should have indexical elements, there is one line of reasoning concerning explanation of propositional attitudes, which is of particular importance. And it's about that line of reasoning that I want to say something in what will be, well, my second set of remarks, but more briefly. Many authors feel that Fregean thoughts, of which I spoke in, of which I've previously spoken of, cannot be what one appeals to when one gives psychological explanations. So people will be happy enough to grant that truth bearers can't have indexical elements, but insist that, well, truth bearers by themselves can't be the objects of psychological explanation. This is the concern, I take it, that Evans gives expression to when he writes in Understanding Demonstratives. Now, many philosophers have concluded that Frege intended to abandon the notion of what is said or the thought expressed, which was psychologically real in the sense of being the object of propositional attitudes, and was giving expression to the idea that two people would express the same thought provided that they refer to the same object in whatever way and say the same thing about it. Now, of course, the concern here is that thoughts, Fregean thoughts, Gedanken, can't be the relevant objects of psychological explanation, because for them to play that role, for them to be, as Evans puts it here, psychologically real, they would have to in some way be more fine-grained. Now, I take it that one line of reasoning which leads from the concern that Fregean thoughts aren't sufficiently fine-grained to the conclusion that whatever the content of psychological states are, in some cases they have to have indexical elements. I take it that one line of reasoning focuses on the role that thought plays in action. And the concern is about there being an individuation which requires a certain connection to worldly circumstance. Let me put the line of reasoning in somewhat schematic form. Oh, sorry, once again. Sorry, I've forgotten to scroll, of course. Okay. Yes, the multitasking is turning out to be a bit of a challenge for me. So let me put the line of reasoning which I'm interested in the following schematic form. So part of the explanation of why John, at a certain point, exchanges an item in his shopping cart involves reference to a certain belief state. Presumably, just having a certain belief state isn't a reason to do something, but having a certain belief state is part of an explanation of why someone comes to do something, such as an exchange an item in his shopping cart. The relevant belief state in the case that we're interested in the infamous case that you know I'm referring to, is a state about a certain individual, about John himself. As long as the specification of that state has no indexical element, it is conceivable that the person should entertain it but fail to be moved. So as long as we give a individuating description of it, it's conceivable that the person should grasp that description but not be moved to do the relevant thing, so that the belief state doesn't play the explanatory role that we want it to play. Now, the question that one can raise, the fact that it's conceivable that that should be so, does that mean that individuating descriptions can not, in fact, play the role that we hope that they'd play? The fact that we can come up with a certain situation in which, a particular situation, in which a certain individuating description does not work and we need a finer one, is that a basis on which to conclude that we always, in any kind of situation, need to come with always finer descriptions until in some way we conclude that descriptions can't do the job? That's the question that I want to raise, which is, of course, a question about the individuation of thought. Do we have to suppose, for thoughts to do the relevant explanatory work, that there are two thoughts wherever an individual might conceivably fail to recognize of what a relevant specification holds? So when François this morning presented, in response to a question, the concern about the so-called intuitive criterion of difference, leading us to individuate thoughts too finely, he at one point compared this, and of course there is that reminiscence, compared it to skeptical scenario. Because, of course, there's the situation in which we're put, which is a situation that involves very particular circumstances, and we're told that in that particular situation, a certain individuating description will not do, which might be right. But the question is, what leads us to then generalize in such a way that we're forced to say that it can never do the job? And so I'd just like to finish by comparing this to the way that Frege often talks about the individuation of thought. In fact, even in the On Sense and Reference, where before he comes to the morning and the evening star, he suggests that we think of individuation of thought in the cases of arithmetic or mathematical proof. The idea being that we have two different thoughts wherever there's room for proof. So for instance, the equations 2 to the power 4 equals 4 squared, that equation expresses a different thought than, say, the equation 4 times 4 equals 4 squared if there's room for proof. Now, whether there's room for proof is something that we can leave open. The important point is that whether there's room for proof is not simply a psychological matter to do with any particular agent that tries to take in the proof. So it's one thing for a proof to have made recognizable a certain truth. It's a very different matter for someone to recognize that proof. So an individual may be in a position even to take in the proof, but fail to do so. But that's no reason to change the proof if it is a proof. Or to put it another way, that's no reason to individuate more finely between thoughts and include further steps. If it's been proved, it's been proved. And if an individual is unable to take in the proof, well then, tant pis for him or her. In any case, if we take this suggestion as a basis for individuating between thoughts, well, the idea is we have two different thoughts wherever there's no room for proof, which is not a psychological matter. And in that case, it seems like when we have propositions or thoughts that turn on particular objects, there's no reason why individuating descriptions shouldn't be able to do the job perfectly well. At times we might find out that an individuating description hasn't been distinguished from another one finely enough. We might have to restrict it, so it might not do to specify the thought that's about a particular person by referring simply to it being that person. We might have to have the thought depend on a particular feature of that person, so we thereby restrict the definite description. But what isn't clear is why one might think that the fact that individuals may fail in particular circumstances to grasp the significance of a certain thought is a basis to further individuate or to further split thoughts in a way that seems to make individuating descriptions insufficient generally. And it's of course that which is meant to get us to think that we somehow have to introduce indexical elements at the level of the content of psychological states. Okay, thanks.